Not in front of my friends, she said, and her fingers slid out of mine like they'd never belonged there. I didn't argue. I didn't smile it off. I just let my hand fall to my side and stayed where I was while the noise of the rooftop event swallowed the moment whole. The place was packed with people who knew her name. Cameras flashed. Laughter landed on cue. My wife, Claire, moved easily through the crowd, her posture changing the second she stepped away from me. With them, she was radiant. With me, she kept distance, half a step ahead, always angled just enough to look unattached. I stayed quiet, nursing a drink I didn't want, watching how naturally she leaned toward Evan. He was already there, already familiar to everyone who mattered to her. Creative director. Easy smile. A hand at the small of her back that no one questioned. Certainly not her friends. When she laughed at something he said, she didn't check if I saw it. She didn't need to. I was background. The reliable blur standing near the railing. The guy people assumed would always be there and never be noticed. Later that evening, as conversations shifted and people broke into smaller circles, she glanced back at me. Her eyes paused, just long enough to register something missing. My hand never reached for hers again. I didn't step closer. I didn't follow when she moved. That was the first time she looked unsettled. Not angry, not embarrassed. Just unsure why the space between us stayed empty, and why I seemed perfectly fine leaving it that way. The first crack didn't come from her. It came from someone who had nothing to gain by lying to me. A few days later, during lunch at the office, my manager mentioned the agency Claire had been consulting for. He said Evan's name casually, like it was common knowledge, like everyone already knew how often those two were seen together outside of work. Dinners, openings, weekends framed as networking. The tone wasn't accusatory. It was observational. The kind of comment people make when something has been obvious for a while. I didn't react. I kept eating, nodded once, and let the conversation move on. From the outside, nothing changed. I still went home, still asked how her day was, still listened while she talked about projects and clients, careful never to mention names when Evan was involved. But I started noticing patterns. Invitations she didn't pass along, photos that never included me, stories that began with "we" and ended without explanation. When she scrolled through her phone at night, she angled the screen away without thinking. Muscle memory does that when it's been practiced long enough. One evening, she mentioned an upcoming industry mixer and said it would be better if I skipped it. She said it lightly, like a scheduling detail, like she was doing me a favor. I agreed without hesitation. No argument. No disappointment. That was when her eyes searched my face for a reaction she didn't find. I stayed calm. I stayed agreeable. And somewhere between that conversation and the quiet that followed, she stopped asking where I'd be and started assuming I'd simply be absent. The proof didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced in fragments, the kind that don't announce themselves unless you're already paying attention. One evening, while fixing a router issue from home, I noticed our shared calendar updating in real time. Meetings moved. Dinners renamed. Blocks of time marked busy that didn't match what she'd told me earlier. I didn't comment. I watched the entries shift, then lock. Later, her tablet buzzed on the kitchen counter while she showered. The screen lit up just long enough to show a preview from a group chat tied to Evan's agency. A photo thumbnail loaded before the notification faded. Her face was in it. So was his hand, visible on her shoulder. The background wasn't an office. It was a bar I recognized from one of her work nights. I didn't open anything. I didn't need to. The pattern was already clear. Over the next few days, I noticed small financial changes. Charges rerouted to her personal card. Ride receipts I hadn't seen before. Hotels listed under conference rates during weekends she claimed were off the grid. At home, nothing shifted. She still moved around me easily, talking through logistics, asking if I could handle a few errands while she ran late. I nodded. I complied. I stayed predictable. What changed was my timing. I started leaving earlier, coming back later. I stopped syncing my schedule to hers. When she looked up from her phone to ask where I'd been, I was already in the next room, shutting a door she hadn't noticed was open. I didn't announce anything. I just stopped showing up where she expected me to be. The first time it happened, she didn't notice. She went to an evening event assuming I'd meet her there later, the way I always had. I didn't. I turned my phone off and took a late train out of the city, letting the noise thin into silence as buildings gave way to dark windows and empty platforms. By the time I checked my phone the next morning, there were missed calls stacked neatly, growing more urgent as the night went on. No messages accusing, just questions. Where are you? Are you okay? Call me. I didn't respond. I stayed gone longer than planned. I worked remotely from a small hotel, logged into meetings like nothing had changed. When colleagues asked if I was traveling, I said yes and left it there. No details, no timeline. Back home, I knew the house would be loud with her absence even when she was there. I could picture her pacing, checking social media, scanning photos from the night before, and realizing how visible she'd been without me. Not abandoned, just unaccompanied. When I finally returned, I didn't explain. I moved through the space quietly, unpacked, went to sleep in the guest room without comment. She stood in the hallway watching, waiting for a reaction she could manage. The next day, she asked if something was wrong. Her voice stayed neutral, controlled. I told her I'd been busy and left for work before she could follow up. That was when the panic started. Not because I'd disappeared, but because I'd done it without permission. Evan didn't know I existed outside of a name she avoided saying at home. That made watching him easy. I never contacted him. I didn't need to. In my line of work, systems reveal more than people think when they're confident no one is looking. A few late evenings, a few public records, a few open tabs left unattended during collaborative calls, and his world started to look less polished than the image he sold. Nothing illegal on the surface. Just enough overlap to make certain people nervous if the right questions were asked. Client boundaries blurred. Expenses categorized generously. Favors traded where invoices should have been clean. I didn't expose anything myself. I passed along fragments quietly, anonymously, to places where compliance mattered and curiosity was routine. No accusations. Just information that invited review. The shift was subtle at first. Claire mentioned that Evan was stressed, that his agency was dealing with internal noise. She said it like gossip, like it didn't concern her. But her phone stayed in her hand longer than usual, her thumb hovering, waiting. She started coming home earlier. She asked if I'd be attending an upcoming gallery opening. I said I wasn't sure. It was the truth. At the opening, I didn't appear. She went anyway. Evan was there, but distracted, pulled aside more than once, his attention split between conversations he couldn't control. She stood next to him, smiling too tightly, suddenly aware of how exposed she looked without me nearby. Later that night, she asked where I'd been. I told her I'd had other plans and went to bed without elaborating. For the first time, she stayed awake, staring at a screen that no longer reassured her. The shift reached her circle before it reached her. At a small dinner hosted by one of her longtime friends, I wasn't there. That alone drew attention. People were used to me being present but quiet, filling space without claiming it. My absence left a gap that conversation kept circling. She arrived alone and stayed near the center of the table, posture perfect, smile calibrated. Evan showed up later than planned and left earlier than expected. The energy never settled. Someone asked, casually, whether I'd changed roles or schedules. Another person commented that they hadn't seen me around in a while. No one pressed. They didn't need to. She told me later that the night felt strange. She said it like an observation, not a complaint. I listened without reacting, focused on something else, letting the silence stretch longer than she was comfortable with. Over the next few days, invitations stopped including my name by default. Some hosts messaged me separately, checking in, asking if I'd like to come by sometime. I accepted one. I declined another. I didn't loop her in. At a weekend event, she scanned the room more than usual. She kept checking entrances, glancing over shoulders, expecting to see me appear and restore balance. I didn't. Someone eventually asked her, quietly, if everything was okay at home. The question wasn't intrusive. It was concerned. That made it worse. She came back unsettled, her confidence dulled by something she couldn't point to. Not scandal, not confrontation, just the slow realization that people were noticing she was standing alone, and not by choice. She started looking for anchors where she used to assume they existed. At home, she lingered in doorways, asking neutral questions that didn't need answers. She offered updates about her day that landed softly and went nowhere. I stayed present but unreachable, answering only what was asked, never adding weight to the exchange. Evan faded from her vocabulary. Not erased, just minimized. His name stopped surfacing. His stress stopped being mentioned. The silence around him grew heavy enough to notice. One evening, I came back later than usual. I wasn't alone. I didn't make a show of it. I walked in calmly with a woman from a networking event I'd attended on my own. She was warm, confident, and entirely unconcerned with who might see us together. We spoke briefly in the entryway, laughed once, and she left with an easy goodbye that didn't require permission. Claire watched from the kitchen, frozen between curiosity and disbelief. She didn't interrupt. She waited until the door closed, then asked who that was. Her tone stayed measured, but the control she relied on had thinned. I told her it was someone who didn't ask me to hide. That was all. After that, she started paying closer attention. To when I left, to where I went, to how often my phone stayed silent on the table while hers buzzed unanswered. At events, she scanned the room and found me already there, already engaged, already leaving with someone else. No displays, no explanations, just movement she couldn't track. She wasn't angry yet. She was disoriented, and for the first time, she didn't know how to pull me back without exposing what she'd spent years protecting. She waited until the house was quiet before trying to close the distance. I was in the living room, scrolling through something unrelated, when she sat across from me instead of beside me. She didn't touch me. That alone told me how unsure she was. Her posture stayed composed, but her breathing was shallow, like she was preparing for resistance she didn't know how to handle. She asked what was happening between us. Not why I was distant. Not whether I was angry. Just what was happening, as if naming it might give her leverage. I didn't rush to answer. I let the silence settle long enough for her to feel it. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice even and brief. I told her things had changed. I didn't explain how or when. I didn't list reasons. She tried again, this time softer. She said she felt like she was losing me. The words landed carefully, chosen to sound vulnerable without admitting fault. I listened without interrupting, without correcting the version of events she was offering. She asked if there was someone else. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I told her I was spending time where I didn't have to negotiate my presence. That was the moment her control slipped. Not outwardly. Internally. I could see it in the way her hands folded and unfolded, in how her eyes searched my face for something familiar and didn't find it. She reached for clarity. I stayed still. When she realized there would be no argument, no reassurance, no emotional exchange to recalibrate around, her voice faltered. And for the first time, she understood that I wasn't pulling away to be chased. I was already gone from the place she used to reach me. The collapse didn't happen loudly. It unfolded in plain sight, one social misstep at a time. Evan stopped appearing altogether. His name resurfaced once, briefly, attached to a project that was suddenly reassigned. Claire didn't comment on it. She adjusted her schedule instead, filling evenings that used to be occupied with empty appearances and forced dinners. Her status shifted, subtly at first. Fewer invitations, later calls, conversations that ended sooner than they used to. People were still polite, still friendly, but the ease was gone. She felt it every time she walked into a room and realized no one was orienting themselves around her anymore. At home, she moved carefully, like the space no longer belonged to her by default. She cleaned things that weren't dirty. She reorganized drawers that didn't need it. She watched me from a distance, trying to read a pattern that wasn't there. One evening, she scrolled through old photos on her phone. I could see the reflection from across the room. Images from years ago surfaced, events where I stood beside her, hand visible, steady, unhidden. At the time, she'd cropped those moments out. Now they lingered on her screen longer than the recent ones. She tried reaching out to friends who used to respond instantly. Some replied hours later. Some didn't at all. The silence accumulated. I came and went without updating her. I lived differently now, not in defiance, but in motion. Her unraveling wasn't something I watched closely. It arrived on its own, in the way her voice softened, in the way she hesitated before speaking, in the realization that the one person who had always been there was no longer positioned as a fallback. And this time, there was no one else stepping in to hold her place. The last moment wasn't dramatic. It was quiet enough to be missed by anyone who wasn't living inside it. She found me in the entryway one evening as I was putting on my jacket. No raised voice. No accusations. Just a stillness that hadn't been there before. She asked where I was going, then corrected herself and said it didn't matter. The shift was small, but it carried weight. She stood there longer than necessary, searching for something to hold on to. When she spoke again, her voice was stripped of polish. She said she finally understood when it had started to slip. Not the affair, not the damage. The moment she'd asked me to let go of her hand and assumed I would reach for it again later. I didn't step closer. I didn't reassure her. I listened, nodded once, and finished buttoning my coat. She asked if there was any way back. The question wasn't strategic anymore. It was exposed. I looked at her, really looked, and saw someone who had mistaken silence for permanence. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I told her I'd simply stopped showing up where I had to shrink to be tolerated. I said it calmly, without bitterness, and watched the words land. When I opened the door, she didn't follow. She stayed where she was, surrounded by the life she'd curated so carefully and lost so quietly. I walked out alone, not in anger, not in triumph, but with the certainty of someone who no longer needed to be chosen. For the first time, my hand was free, and it stayed that way by choice.